he couldn't accept his World Press Prize a year ago because he was in Gaza. And when someone actually dropped out at the last moment, I said, we must have Mohammed Salem. And they were able to bring him in from Rome. And he was so moving. His pictures are so incredible. All the signs are that there's going to be some kind of settlement in a case that shouldn't even be, it should be fought, not settled. I think in the UK, it's somewhat harder. I mean, I think for a start, we have a much more plural press anyway. I don't see that kind of threat building with the kind of velocity that it has in the US. And he wanted to be able to call out the Thatcher government when they were doing things that, he considered he wanted his journalists to go on working as independent journalists, even though, real quote journalism gets drowned out, by the dross. I do think it can still really cut through, as we saw with that Signalgate scandal.
Well, we're joined now by the indefatigable, the relentless, the famous Substacker, Tina Brown. Tina, thanks so much for coming in.
So thrilled to be here instead of just listening, which is what I do every morning on my way to the breakfast diner in New York.
This is why she's so successful. Tina, I want to talk about your extraordinary career in journalism, your life in journalism. As a working journalist myself, there's 1,000 things I could ask you. But first I want to talk a little bit about why you're in London. I know you, of course, come back and forth all the time, but in particular, you just had your latest Truth Tellers conference, which you were kind enough to ask me to be at last year. Just tell us a little bit about it, why you felt motivated, particularly, I mean, you could sort of do anything, really. And this is what you've chosen to do. Tell people about it.
Well, I founded Truth Tellers 3 years ago as part of my husband, Sir Harry Evans' legacy.
And just to remind younger listeners, Harry Evans, of course, was the legendary editor of the Sunday Times, one of the most famous investigative journalists of all time.
Yeah, he was a great crusading journalist, actually, of that period, and went on all his life to care about truth and facts and getting it right, and just focus on getting it right maniacally. So I thought that to honour his legacy, it was to start a Sir Harry Evans Investigative Journalism Fellowship, which we have. We're now on our third Harry Evans Fellow, and also to start an annual convening, which I do with Reuters, to celebrate actually and sort of valorize great journalists, because media conferences are always sort of somehow long tassered sort of intra-industry events a lot of the time. Obviously there are some good ones, but I really wanted to focus on the guys who get the story and who make journalism important and exciting. And so we started the first year. Our opening act, as it were, was Woodward and Bernstein, which I thought was sort of making the point. And we've gone on.
Who unveiled,
Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, the Watergate legends. And we've gone on really to it's become a real thing, and at the summit this week, we had incredible global journalists from extraordinary investigations from all over the world. And then we also had, Yulia Navalny as our sort of close, as someone who really represents, truth and justice and valor, essentially, under pressure. So it's a wonderful mix of those kind of people. And big sort of media names, and Emily Maitlis and John Sopel, for instance, and Sir Mark Thompson, CEO of CNN, and Joe Kahn, the editor of the New York Times, Jeffrey Goldberg, who of course was the man of the hour when his cell phone started pinging, and he found that he'd been invited to into a group chat with half the Trump cabinet.
So if only all journalism was that easy.
Exactly. He said, it's the great millennial scoop. I just sat here waiting for something to happen. So it was a wonderful mix. I mean, Jeffrey Goldberg was hilarious, actually, about all of that. At the same time, our hearts were just torn asunder by Yulia Navalny, and also the great Mohammed Salem, who is a photographer who just got out of Gaza 2 months ago for Reuters. And, he couldn't accept his World Press Prize a year ago because he was in Gaza. And when someone actually dropped out at the last moment, I said, we must have Mohammed Salem. And they were able to bring him in from Rome, and he was so moving. His pictures are so incredible. We just went through this slideshow of the work that he's done. Many of the images of Gaza that he showed were images that you'll recognize if if they were put in front of you, because they became like the worldwide pictures, but you don't know they've been taken by Mohammed Salem. And he was so incredible. He got a standing ovation.
And of course, I mean, the name of the conference is instructive, Truth Tellers, and you've already said it. Obviously, anybody who is engaged in journalism, as journalists, Harry Evans certainly one of the best examples of it, believes and values and you kind of have to believe that truth matters. But that concept obviously has been pushed and pressed, perhaps to destruction in recent years, right? That faith, that idea that the truth does matter. Do you still think the truth does matter in contemporary politics and journalism?
Well, that is absolutely the philosophy of the summit. I mean, one of the things about Harry was that, he was never sort of remotely impressed by the sort of defeated notion of a, quote, post-truth world that became like a kind of catchphrase. He'd say, what are you talking about, a post-truth world? There is not a post-truth world, there is truth,
And if we say it, we might create it.
Exactly right. Well, no, I think there has been a kind of fashionability about we're just going to accept that we live in a world where everybody half gets it wrong, and it's so much more interesting to be talking about sort of podcasters alone who rant, not this podcast, but like some of these kind of huge influencers with millions and millions of followings, but at the same time they're just sitting there ranting about crazy conspiracy theories. No, this whole ethic of the summit is about no, we stand up against that. And as Jeffrey Goldberg said, truth bats last. I mean, at the end, people understand that it's lies at the end. But unfortunately, Donald Trump's influence over the last,
decade, really,
yeah, the Trump era, he's been so effective at drilling into people's heads the idea that the media is lies, that, mainstream media, in quotes, are, is just biased, is slanted, is and it's been very effective, actually.
Yeah, and it's easy to point to Trump, and there are lots of sort of Trump-like actors in most Western countries now, including in Britain, who have done that. And that's clearly part of the reason why, objectively speaking, you look at the polling, you can see that journalists have become, in some cases, despised, certainly less trusted than they may have been a couple of decades ago. But is Trump and people like him the whole story?
Not
or is
at
it
all.
Is it partly ourselves?
No, I think it's many factors, actually. I mean, first of all, obviously, the digital disruption. In the early 2000s, for some reason, journalism was supine in the face of the sort of predatory, frankly, Silicon Valley, who came in essentially and stole all the content and monetized it for themselves. And everybody said, oh, how exciting, I'm getting all this traffic, I'm getting all these readers, I'm getting but it was free. And they were monetizing it and we weren't. And only when we suddenly woke up and realized that the business model of journalism had collapsed, essentially, that people kind of came to understand that actually that they were being, it was a big con. They were actually being ripped off. This time around, with the sort of rise of AI, journalism companies are trying to be this time more alert and awake, and making trying to make deals whereby they get actually some kind of payment for their intellectual property being scraped and taken. But ultimately, Silicon Valley will always win in this because they have the massive money and they have the massive numbers, and they're just going to steamroller. And that is unfortunately the situation we're in. So the collapse of the business model, of course, meant that the influx of sort of trash and crazy people publishing lies, etc., the volume of that rose incredibly intensely. It has, of course, also allowed some brilliant new platforms to start. So, I mean, there is an upside to it. But unfortunately, the impact on truth has been very deleterious. I mean, it's been easy for the bad to push out the good, and the good has to fight really hard, essentially, to get more attention in this kind of unbelievable sort of storm of dross that comes at you from every corner.
What about ourselves? Do you think that journalism itself, I mean, you say, perhaps journalists were too slow to realise about this predation of some of these companies from Silicon Valley and so on. But in how we've approached the age of Trump, about how we've approached the age of, quote unquote, I know you don't like the phrase, but the post-truth world, have we ourselves failed in terms of not adapting quickly enough to the changes in the way political actors have changed? We just treat them almost, at least at the beginning, like we did. They were normal politicians and we could treat them as such.
I think that we do have a lot to blame ourselves. I mean, to be honest, in Trump's first term, the biggest blame really was falling a victim to his act, essentially. I mean, he gives the most enormous bump to our numbers, let's face it. I mean, the Trump bump, as it's called, he created this huge interest and everybody wanted that Trump bump.
There is a mutual sort of beneficial relationship.
There's no doubt about it.
Two, right?
There's no doubt about it. Everybody's circulation went up in that period. But unfortunately, it also had the effect, I think, of many sort of news outlets thinking that sort of Trump bump effect of having all this kind of rage against him, etc., was a really so good for numbers that more and more it became these kind of ranting heads on television. And I think that has been a problem. I think Trump too, journalism is doing much, much better, I
Do
have
you?
to say. Yeah, I think we have now become more alert to the act, more cynical of the act. And although Trump is being covered 24/7, frankly, he should be. He's changing the world. So
Yeah.
he has to be covered. I was fascinated at our summit, the Truth Tellers Summit on Wednesday. The editor of the New York Times said that they do at the New York Times a Trump story every 30 minutes, which
Every
is
30
incredible.
minutes.
Every 30 minutes,
Wow.
the New York Times is posting a Trump story. And, he was asked, well, is that too much? He said, no, because the President of the United States is always going to make news. And a lot of the stuff he's doing is consequential. Do you have to chase after the meme about him that he posted about himself, dressed as the Pope? Well, it's worth a kind of a small story, but it's not worth spending 3 days on. And that's the whole point with Trump. You have to be able to kind of sort, the kind of shiny objects from the real stuff, and somehow quickly you can tell them about the shiny thing, but you've got to keep focused on the really consequential things that he's doing.
I want to talk about Trump a little bit more detail, but since you mentioned him in American journalism, might as well ask you now. Do you think, you say Trump too, American journalism is dealing with him better. Mm-hmm. That said, there have been many attempts from Trump to intimidate in an even more profound way, perhaps than he did in Trump 1, particularly using litigation against American journalists, American networks, and so on. And there have been quite a few cases where, frankly, that succeeded. Is that not an example or a case of actually, particularly more establishment networks and so on, failing?
Completely failing. I suppose in my mind, I differentiate from the brilliant, brave reporting that journalists are doing and the craven amoeba-like behaviour of the owners of media.
And that's worse than Trump 1.
Much worse. No, because in Trump 1, they weren't as intimidated by the president at all, because in fact, most of the owners were still kind of outright Democrats. A lot of them giving money to, they weren't intimidated by Trump. They thought that he was a passing sort of nightmare that they would deal with. But he was far less aggressive in a serious way towards the press than he is in this term. In the first term, it was all about trashing and trolling the press. This term, it is about ejecting serious journalists from the White House press pool and replacing them with a ridiculous sort of influencer marginals from the extremes of MAGA. It is about very, very bad litigation against media companies if they cross him. And it is also about making it easier to subpoena journalists' records. It is about, harassing journalists with this constant threat of retribution. And it's got to the point where actually foreign news outlets are telling their journalists when they enter the United States to bring burner phones with them. This is something quite different and much, much more worrying. And journalists are beginning to feel genuinely unsafe. And what is actually terrible is the way so many of their media bosses are just folding, as you rightly said. I mean, we've had a Jeff Bezos at the Washington Post completely folding, Amazon commissioning a $40 million documentary on Melania Trump, which, it's an insane amount of money they would never pay to anybody. It is straight, clearly about, sycophancy. You have Trump's lawsuit against CBS because 60 Minutes, their kind of crown jewel of their news outlets, did an interview with Kamala Harris before the election, which he deemed to be too friendly and cut he deemed in a too positive way, which was just nonsense. It was just a regular cut, that you would do for in any show, and they're just folding. I mean, it looks like in the CBS case, it's now in mediation, but all the signs are that there's going to be some kind of settlement in a case that shouldn't even be. It should be fought, not settled.
And do you think? I mean, obviously, everything feels like it's very much up for grabs in British politics at the moment over the next few years. I mean, do you think that sort of chill wind, that sort of intimidation, do you think it could happen here? Because actually, what we don't have, I mean, the US, despite it all, does have the First Amendment. We don't have the First Amendment. In many ways, our press freedoms could potentially be more vulnerable than they would be in the US.
I think that anybody who's kind of owned by a company that has got sort of business before the government is obviously going to be much more vulnerable than someone who isn't. The problem with these corporates in America is that they've all got business before the government. So the Jeff Bezos of the world, the owner of the LA Times, who's been completely fawning as well, he's also capitulated. ABC capitulation as well to Trump. Disney, which owns ABC, is very much has things before the government. So your vulnerability is if you have something before the government. It's not surprising that the Atlantic, which is owned by the widow of Steve Jobs, who has no kind of corporate conflicts, is actually one of the few places at the moment where they don't feel the threat of Trump's sort of, hot, breath on their organization. Because she said, Mrs. Jobs, Lorraine Powell Jobs said, I've never had so much credit for standing still. She just is okay with all the harassment. And I think in the UK, it's somewhat harder. I mean, I think for a start, we have a much more plural press anyway. I think that I don't see that kind of threat building with the kind of velocity that it has in the US. The money, the numbers, the massive kind of conglomerates in the US, it's not really the same in the UK. We've always had sort of Tory, for instance, press owners, and they're unabashedly Tory. Their outlets are Tory.
They could be about to become Reform press owners pretty quickly.
Indeed, we could. But I don't know whether or not Farage would go in that direction. I haven't seen that in Farage really yet. But it could happen. We didn't really see it in Trump until he got power.
And since you mentioned the British media, the British press barons, I mean, obviously, and this will affect the US as well, Rupert Murdoch is not a young man. Although technically he's supposed to have stepped away from the company, we know that in all sorts of ways he certainly hasn't. When the day does come that Rupert Murdoch is no longer with us, what do you think is going to happen in terms of the effect on the UK media landscape and in the US as well? Because it will be a big moment, won't it? He is in many ways the last of those sort of big 20th century media
He is
barons.
Indeed. And in fact, he is exactly the kind of example of what we're discussing, in the sense that he always wanted to be on the side of the power, whatever it was going to be, and he would pressure the editors to do the same. It's incredible to think of the decades and decades that Rupert Murdoch has influenced the press and politics in this country. It is really remarkable. And of course, he's done the same in the US with Fox News, which arguably is the reason we have Trump in the first place. So his influence is going to be, I think his reputation, hopefully, will be a very malign one. I think that there'll be a lot of people who talk about what a great entrepreneur he was and how kind of creative he was, which is true. The tragedy with Rupert Murdoch was all of those gifts that he did have, and he had undeniable gifts, were all put to such an amoral sort of goal, which was pure, naked power without any kind of ethical outcome. I mean...
And there are many people, though, of course, as you know, Tina, who say that he has been a huge positive factor in British journalism because he's bought and invested in the Times and so on. Now, of course, your late husband, Harry Evans, had many run-ins with Rupert Murdoch when he was editor of the Times. He wrote about that in his memoir. So I suppose, in that sense, it's clear you would disagree. But what do you make of that analysis? There are lots of people, as you know, who say that he's been a more positive force in British media.
Yeah, I realise that. And I think he has done some positive things because he is a very creative entrepreneur who, when he does focus and when he does let you do it, he's actually very good. The problem is that his overall effect in the end is going to be far worse because, I mean, the phone hacking issue was an absolute disgrace. I mean, it was a sort of criminal disgrace and so kind of degraded journalism in this country.
What was it about when Harry Evans was working with him or working for him? What was it that he found so distasteful about Murdoch?
He found exactly what I'm discussing. He found that when Rupert was being the brilliant entrepreneur he could talk to about newspapers, there was actually nobody better. I mean, because he understood what made a good paper. If Harry wanted to do something that was kind of, let's do this, imaginative idea that will need investment, Rupert would always really get it. The problem is that what he also wanted was absolute power over the coverage when it mattered to him. And they really fell out about his insistence that Harry supported Mrs. Thatcher at the time. And Harry wanted to do not Labour or SDP as it was then, journalism, but journalism. He wanted to be able to call out the Thatcher government when they were doing things that, he considered. He wanted his journalists to go on working as independent journalists. And Rupert didn't. And that's all it was about. And in the end, he wasn't going to be able to survive. So Rupert has always then understood how to create a culture which, it's called, working towards the Führer, if you like. The whole policy of like, you don't have to tell people. He puts people in who understand what are the sort of red lines that you don't want to cross, and you just don't, Having said that, I think that the Wall Street Journal, he's invested in, and he has not intervened there, and it's been it's a great paper. I think because he understands, and he is, obviously super intelligent, Rupert, he understands that it would be the death of the brand, essentially, if he did.
Do you think that whoever is left in charge, and obviously that's an open question, do you think they'll sell off the UK papers?
I'm sure that they will. It depends who it is.
Yeah.
I think that the only one in that family, I think, who sort of still hankers to be some kind of a media baron with Murdoch, sort of, the News International, as they were then called. I don't know what they're called anymore, actually, is Lachlan, and I think that it depends on how this case comes out when the fight between the kids,
Yeah. I mean,
I think it'll be sold off.
It's sometimes said that someone like Elon Musk or even Bezos, that we sort of overinterpret how novel that they are. In some ways, that maybe they're just a little bit like a Murdoch or a Rothermere or a Beaverbrook, the sort of press barons of old. Do you think that's right? Or do you think that Musk, for example, controlling Twitter in terms of its impact on journalism is something substantively new?
I think they're very different. This new crop, if you like, of billionaires and media lusters, because I don't think they understand or care remotely about sort of journalism or content. They really don't. Musk just saw Twitter as a platform for his own absolutely now, very authoritarian ideology that he now has. And he controls this mouthpiece, and he's using it sort of relentlessly. The rest of them, I think, just have no interest in journalism. They don't understand journalism or value journalism at all. And they don't... Or truth. I think they don't know. I think that they think this concept that they've minted, which has been so effective for them, to say we're not media companies, we're platforms, we have no responsibility for anything that we publish, anything goes, any kind of material can just go up, and we have no responsibility for any of it. I think that ultimately it's proven to be, both just so damaging for society that I just don't know how they can continue to say that, quite honestly. I mean, when you consider the damage done by Meta to teenage girls and to, they know that the algorithm is addictive, and they just, they consider it's a moneymaker, so they're not going to change. And that's really all it's about. It's purely about being unfettered from any responsibility. They do not want responsibility. So even though, they always get very dodgy and sort of evasive. If you say to any of the platform people, well, what are your methods of, sort of quality content moderation, monitoring? They get very slippery and they start talking about, well, we have, these mechanisms where we monitor. I mean, they're not really doing it. I mean, not in a serious way, because if they wanted to do it seriously, they can. And they just choose not to. So I'm very cynical about it at this point. I think, unfortunately, I think that the horse has bolted, and there is just no way, in a sense, to stop that trend, because their money is just so vast, their power is so vast. It's a very difficult thing.
You think they're more powerful than someone like Murdoch, even at his height?
I think they are, yes. I think they are more powerful at this point. But Murdoch has shaped the culture in ways that is really incredible. I mean, he's both amazingly brilliant in the way he started something like Fox News. He was right. There was an underserved market there for kind of flyover country America, if you like. But the way that they went on through the election, broadcasting the lies about it being a stolen election, they knew, as we know, I mean, they had a huge lawsuit about it.
Yeah.
But they still went on doing it. That's the part I can't really forgive them for, knowingly doing things that they know are actually not true.
We'll be back with more from Tina Brown right after this. Tina, I just wanted to, a quote of yours from quite recently sort of caught my eye, and I just thought it might be a really useful thing for you to talk about and explain, particularly with regards to the future of journalism, which is what we're talking about. You said, I think we've got to discriminate between what is journalism and what is, quote marks, content. Just explain what you meant by that, because it seems to me to sum up so much about where we're at.
Well, I truly believe that journalism, is a higher calling. I mean, I think it's about inquiry. It's about getting to the facts. It's about sleuthing through data and going back for the next quote and cross-checking and making sure you got it right, and all of these things that we associate with real journalism. And I think that content is just a commodity. I think it's just stuff you can aggregate. You can just
So Joe Rogan would be content.
Joe Rogan is just content. Well, Joe Rogan is just a great sort of he gets on the air and he mouths off. I think he's extremely talented as a sort of quasi comedian quote talk show host. I think he's extraordinarily good at that. I mean, his interviews are 3 hours long. I mean, just being able to sustain that unbelievable.
It's like a John Sopel interview.
It's like a gab fest that you can't stop, and people do it. So he's very gifted. Don't want to sort of undersell his gifts. I think anyone who can do that is obviously gifted at that, but it's nothing to do with journalism at all.
There are a few people who are better equipped to sort of assess the landscape, the long-term landscape of journalism, than you on both sides of the Atlantic. Not least because younger listeners might not be aware. I mean, you started your journalism career at a senior level very early on. I mean, you were editor of Tatler at 25, editor of Vanity Fair at 30. I often get, I'm sure you get, young journalists sort of come to you and say, advice, ask you for, how they should get into the industry and all those sorts of things. You as a 25 and then 30-year-old woman editing these, big publications, what was that like? How did you summon the self-confidence to do that? Because it is an extraordinary feat.
I mean, it was so much fun to me. I mean, I think that I just kind of surged ahead like a Japanese bullet train. I just,
Did you not think about it? Did you not have self-doubt?
Well, I didn't actually. I think when you're young, you have sort of really young. You just have this kind of crazy Dutch courage or something. But when I took over Tatler, it was just this kind of little depleted, silly sort of debutante thing. And so there really were no stakes to it. I mean, there was nothing to lose for sure. I mean, I was 25. The magazine was a joke, and somebody bought it and couldn't find anyone to edit it. And they think they'd offered to everybody in town, and nobody serious wanted to do it. And then they just thought, well, we'll go for use, we'll go for sort of a comer. And so I got it, and I just hired all my sort of funny, young Turk friends. And they all soon, I mean, they just developed a voice. And I knew that I wanted to make it into this sort of, to take the ethos of, quote, a society magazine and twist it into being a sort of high-low society magazine in which we could combine, the sort of upscale, upmarket, whatever, tough thing that they'd had, but do it in a way with greater reverence and fun, and add to it very good writing. I mean, I had writers like Julian Barnes and Martin Amis and John Mortimer and all these wonderful writers actually for Tatler. But at the same time, we were also like killing it on Lady Di, who was the big rising story. I mean, the Lady Di story sort of was like our O.J. Simpson was to CNN. I mean, we rode the Diana story to sort of, success essentially. And it was a great time to be editing a social magazine, actually.
But then you're asked to edit Vanity Fair at the age of 30, moved to New York, a young woman, age of 30, arriving in Manhattan in sort of age of Reagan, 1980s. What was that like? What was that like for you personally when you first turned up there and you had this bigger magazine and task to take on? It must have been... You weren't intimidated then either?
Well, I wasn't intimidated by the task of turning around Vanity Fair because I knew what Vanity Fair should be. I had a strong vision for it again. What was incredibly challenging was just... I mean, I was like Alice in Wonderland in this insanely, wildly sort of materialistic New York City, as it were, sort of having come from Tatler with a budget of sort of, £15,000 a year to having this kind of mega Condé Nast carapace sort of around me in the HQ in Madison Avenue, which to me was like such a dramatic change. And, I remember that the editorial director, who was a very sort of grand figure, whose name was Alexander Lieberman, he was a Russian emigre who was like this editorial, czar of Condé Nast. And within the first week, I went out to lunch at the restaurant that they always sent us to, which was the Four Seasons, which is like one of the most expensive restaurants in New York. And I came back and he said, "My dear, I must have a word with you." I said, What is it, Alex?" He said, "Your table today I said, well, what was wrong with my table? I said, I was at the Four Seasons. He said, my dear, they put you upstairs. I said, well, so what? He said, you were in Siberia. You cannot have a table in the upstairs section. You must have a table on the ground floor. I will call them immediately. And I just thought, looking back on that now, that just feels like unbelievably sort of hilarious. Here I was in this fanciest of fancy restaurants, and the editorial director of Condé Nast was worrying about the fact I didn't have a good enough table. So there was that sort of wildly it was like Alice in Wonderland for me at the time. But at the same time, Condé Nast in that era, we keep hearing about, quote, the amount of money that was spent, but actually it was a golden era because the owner, Sane UK of Condé Nast, it was a private company. He believed in great magazines. He invested in me and wanted me to turn around this thing, which had been such a flop. He gave me a budget to do it. Yeah, I had to stick to it, by the way. It wasn't quite as it's been portrayed sometimes as some kind of absurd sort of, take this check and do what you like with it. It had its kind of silly side, as I've just explained. But at the same time, it was a moment when editors were being backed to do wonderful stories and only think about the content, which is such a luxury. I mean, how many editors today can say they spend all their time worrying about fabulous pictures and stories and writers? They spend all their time thinking, how do I exist? Where do I go with my tin cup, to get a tiny bit of funding to keep 10 people around me?
Well, I mean, if anyone wants a sense of what an extraordinary time and place it was, they could do a lot worse than read your book, The Vanity Fair Diaries, 1983 to 92, your diaries from the time. It's an extraordinary account. I read it a few years ago, not least because, I was looking through the index again earlier, and it's just this sort of compendium of sometimes historic, certainly, often, the height of celebrity type figures, sort of encyclopedia of anyone who was anyone in New York at that time. And, this age, you've already described, this age of Ronald Reagan, materialism, money everywhere. And there is one figure, of course, who's in it quite a lot, albeit in a sort of shadowy way. And it's Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. Very much a big figure in the 80s then. What was you have some very interesting accounts of him in the book, but what was your impression of him at that time?
Well, see, at the time, Trump was just sort of building Trump Tower, and he was like the ultimate symbol, essentially, of glitz in New York, and in a very entertaining way. I first encountered him because I bought an extract of his book, The Art of the Deal, which at that time was just a manuscript, and some publisher sent it to me, and I read it, and I thought, I think I say in the book, it's all complete bullshit, but I think people will like it, and which is sort of, you could actually say as, on his tombstone, actually. Yeah. So he was, to me, just a great big sort of huckster figure and an amusing one. I first met him at a dinner party, a lunch party, actually, where I had a very boring lunch partner. He had a very boring lunch partner, and we were sort of had these two people in between us. And so we were sort of talking across these people. And the first thing he says to me was, Ivana made me to go to the opera. Unbelievable. I'll never do it again. Never do it again. Like 4 hours and couldn't even get anything to eat. And it's like, Pavarotti, for God's sake, forget about it. And I thought it was hilarious. And he amused me. And we did pieces about him. We did pieces about Ivana, who actually was a big figure herself, a big social figure. And she was bringing Trump much more into society than he ever was since, as a matter of fact. But then his finances began to go bad. And I assigned, of course, a piece about that. And he was enraged. At that point, this is when things began to change, I think, with Trump, when he first began to fail, in his businesses and go through that period where he was bankrupt. And we assigned Marie Brenner to do this wonderful piece, and it was a piece that is still quoted because she noted that he had Hitler's speeches by the bed. That he said he did, and
he had copies of Hitler's speeches by the bed.
Yeah, it was either on his bed or by the bed or on his desk, but it was much quoted at the time, and of course, ever since greatly quoted. And we were at a kind of charity dinner. I was at a table, and Marie Brenner was at the table, and she suddenly kind of felt something cold down her back, and she turned around, and Donald Trump had just passed by and emptied a glass of white wine down her dress.
On purpose?
On purpose, yes. And he looked at her, and laughed. And it was like his payback. And it was unbelievable that someone would do that. And so that was the first moment when one saw this other side of Trump, which is like payback, payback, payback. But I did keep persuading him to do things, much to his misfortune, because I actually then persuaded him to do another piece when I was at the New Yorker. where he talked to Mark Singer, and that was a fantastic piece. I mean, it was like I had taken Trump to breakfast, and I'd said to him, "Look, we're going to do this piece, and you think I used the words that Jeffrey Goldberg used to get in to see him from the Atlantic, which was." We're going to do a very consequential piece about you. Consequential is the great journalist word for like, how can I find a word that won't come back to bite me?
Yeah.
So consequential, that's your word. I said, we're doing this big consequential piece, and I assigned this guy Mark Singer, who he, as he would say, never heard of, and it was hilarious because Mark is a witty takedown artist of the most incredible kind. And it was a brilliant piece that became a huge classic, containing the line I most love about Trump, which is, it's off the record, but you can use it. And he went absolutely ballistic. He left like a sort of 15-minute rage message on a Mark's answer phone. And then when Mark's book came out, he just said, "You're a Mark sent him the book, and he sent it back saying, Mark Singer, you're just a loser."
I mean,
and Mark has it framed beside in his office.
I mean, what strikes me about it from the extracts from the book, and bear in mind, obviously, we're talking about a long time ago. One extract from September 1987, where he's haranguing you because you're sort of stuck together at dinner, and he's haranguing you about which magazine he should have done in terms of a front cover, saying, Tina, I could have had Time. They wanted me, and I saw them too, but Newsweek scooped them. Why do you think that's better, Tina? Newsweek or Time? And you say Time, mischievously.
I said Time, yes.
You really think so, Tina? You really think so? His pouty Elvis face folded into a frown of self-castigation. But even then, he sounds very, very similar.
He hasn't changed in that regard. It was always about attention. Always. And at our Truth Teller Summit on Wednesday, Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic told a wonderful story where just recently he went in to see Trump after the whole drama with the Signalgate, chat. And he said, and Trump said to him, well, you got a lot of attention out of it, didn't you? And attention, that's is the currency. Trump. That's the currency. That's the collateral. How much attention did you get? And the irony, of course, of that comment to me about Trump, Time and Newsweek was that he never got the cover of Time, actually, until he sort of was president. And in fact, he had a fake Time cover of himself pinned up in his office because he wanted to imply that he had been Times Man of the Year, but actually he hadn't been Times Man of the Year until he was like in the presidency.
So having known him during that time, did you find it, and knowing his foibles, knowing what he was like, did you struggle to take the idea of his political aspirations seriously? Did you still? I mean, when you see him there's a part of you that still struggles.
No, I mean, the day that he came down the golden escalator, we all thought it was a kind of mad jape almost, that he was doing it.
Maybe he did.
For attention. I think some of it was about, he'd been irrelevant for a long time. The Apprentice was no longer on the air. He was kind of yesterday's man, actually. So coming down that escalator, we all thought, well, this is the latest Trump stunt. But he is a brilliant political antennae. There's no doubt about it. I mean, he has this incredible ability to understand what people want to hear and how to say it. And he's a great communicator. There is just no doubt about it. And he's also very funny when he wants to be. The difference now is how dark he's become. He's become very, very dark. And his rage and his kind of unassuaged sort of boiling sea of grudges in which he lives now is extraordinary. I mean, you just feel everything is about payback. Everything is about the vindictiveness he feels. I was actually at the White House Correspondents' Dinner in 2000, I think it was 12, the famous night that President Obama roasted Trump. And, I mean, I was sitting in the table behind him, and so I could see the back of his head. And I saw, his neck go from like salmon colour to sort of raging magenta. I mean, the rage he felt. And it wasn't just because Obama was really elegantly and amusingly and lethally, roasting him. It was about that sea, as he thought of it, I think, as the liberal media in that room laughing at him. The liberal media was laughing at him. And he's always had such an incredible chip on his shoulder about being, the boy from Queens rather than Manhattan, from the boroughs who had the father who was like just below the sort of the echelon of being one of the big top, stars of New York real estate. He's just never got over that grudge he felt that he wasn't in the top circle. And, he's paying back that liberal laughing press right now. He really is.
Is it, though? Was it actually in the pages of your book, in a sense, in that the Reagan presidency, this sort of fusion that began between politics and entertainment with Reagan, you can argue it continued. Is that where the sort of first seeds of Trump, though, were sown?
You could say it was that Reagan moment because an actor became president.
Yeah.
Showed it could be done, that crossover. But now, I mean, America is just such an entertainment culture that I just the mesh has happened and will never go back. It's always going to be that way, to the point that I really feel, unless anyone in politics has got the ability to also be some kind of an entertainer, a hugely telegenic figure who can dominate the airways, don't even think about running. I mean, this has been the mistake, essentially, of Democrats. It's like, don't give us a candidate who cannot fight on that field.
Do you see anyone on the Dem side? Let's talk about AOC, of course, who in a way would be a sort of Dem.
Yes, but I think that she's too much of the left to win, Middle America. I do think that.
She would get the attention, though. She would win the attention economy.
She knows how to get the attention, but we'll see how she sort of. She's on right now this big tour with Bernie Sanders, and she's getting crowds. But I think she will. I don't think myself that she will still be able to cut through to the, to the Midwest in the way that she's going to have to. I mean, James Carville at the Truth Teller Summit on Wednesday, he talked a lot about how talented the Democratic bench is. He kept saying, don't imagine there isn't. Don't keep saying there isn't the talent. There is the talent. There is governors and senators and. There's a lot of talent. I still don't see one outstanding person, but politics is a fascinating crucible in that sense. I mean, we don't know who's going to be sort of made by a certain moment in the culture. I mean, Barack Obama's, in a sense, was the first really American Idol presidency, because he came forth by making in the most extraordinary speech at the 2008 Democratic Convention. Yeah. Where it was such a brilliant performance again that he won the adulation of America in a way that leapfrogged him forward to the pack, of the pack. So without that gift, I don't see how you make it. I mean, we've had a lot of... I don't want to hear from anybody, they're brilliant backstage. No, they're amazingly different when they're not on camera. Yeah, yeah. If they can't do it on camera, goodbye. That's how I feel. Yeah. Don't even waste my time.
Which could have some applications to British politics as well.
Well, indeed.
Do you feel that American democracy, let's fast forward to 2029, does it survive in the form that we've known it? Or is it hyperbole to think that the institutions won't survive?
Well, I actually do think that things are more in the balance than people might be acknowledging.
You do?
And I think it's all about how we meet that challenge. At the moment it's the press and the courts. The courts are doing pretty well on the whole. Lawyers, a lot of the
Congress certainly
these cases are going to court. A lot of the cases, and he's losing quite a lot of cases too. So we want the courts obviously to survive in the form that we hope they will. And I think the press does play a hugely important role. And I think that even though real quote journalism gets drowned out by the dross, I do think it can still really cut through, as we saw with that Signalgate scandal. Essentially, it wasn't just that Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic was the recipient of the group chat. He handled it so well. He proved his integrity essentially by not he even got off the chat when he realized what he was listening to, and he wasn't going to reveal nearly the amount that in the end he did reveal until he was challenged and called a liar and called someone who'd made it all up by the Trump team. So he showed that integrity, and he won on many points, I think, for the press in doing that.
If you were a young woman again, would you move to America now?
I think America is irresistible, I've got to say. I mean, I think...
Even if it feels much darker than it did then?
I think America is in a very dark place, yes. And would I want to go there? I think I always would, because it always felt like the big time, honestly. It's enthrallingly exciting. At its worst, it's also big, that you feel the stakes are very, very high, once you've moved there. But I also feel right now that England feels wonderfully sane in comparison. Wonderfully sane. Comically, I ended up, I end up sort of watching House of Commons debates to kind of soothe my nerves. I'll listen to
Finally, someone else.
Exactly. No, I mean, exactly. I'll look at the Scunthorpe debate and I think, wow, very intelligent, decent people are having an argument and they're putting their views across and the other person is allowed to speak and another person speaks. It's democracy at work in a way that's very soothing, frankly.
Yeah.
Because all we're in the middle of this is insane shoutfest and this mad, Louis XIV president sort of hurling thunderbolts, from the White House at us every day so that we're drowned.
You have started a Substack as of last year.
Fresh Hell, it's called.
Fresh Hell. Yeah. Nice and uplifting. Subscribe now. In a way, I mean, Substack is interesting. I mean, I write on there as well. I mean, it can be very liberating because if anyone has ever, written for magazines or newspapers, it takes time and there's that process and the sub-editing and everything like that. But does it, in some ways, does it depress you that perhaps the young Tina Brown today would be going to Substack and just doing everything themselves rather than working for or indeed editing the sort of magazines that you cut your teeth on and led?
Oh, I mean, I've absolutely no, of course, in the sense that I think that to have a magazine to play with a staff and it could not be more fun.
Do you need great editors to make great writers, or can writers make it on their own?
Yeah, I do, and I completely believe in that process, and I love it actually. And I've done 5 magazines, I think it is. I can't really count, but I've loved every one of them in a different way, and I love starting my online site, The Daily Beast. I mean, I love editing. I love the process of having a gang, in the office to put out my stuff and do their great work and inspire them, etc. But, the fact is that either you are in the game or you're not in the game. And the game right now is so many people are actually leaving big mainstream outlets to go and write for Substack because they feel kind of liberated to be in this community of absolutely free thinking, sort of liberated by just being able to do exactly what they want and when they want. I find that very exciting, actually. I mean, I could easily be, doing columns for newspapers or whatever. I wanted to go to Substack because I just thought this is new. I wanted to sample what it's like to be in this direct-to-subscriber universe. And it's very exciting to find yourself suddenly snowballing subscribers who you can see who they are. I mean, you've got all of their emails, you know who they are, you can chat to them directly, learn who they are. It's I'm growing this very interesting, intelligent community of people who it's a wonderful thing to feel the intimacy of that relationship. It's a very different kind of a feeling. When you're editing a magazine, you have a circulation, you don't really quite know who's buying it. You hope you're going up on the newsstand, but it's not an intimate process. Whereas Substack is very intimate. You have this close relationship with your subscribers. And that's kind of heartwarming in its own way. It's also kind of rather thrilling to kind of write something and then kind of choose the pictures and press publish.
You're still editing.
I mean, yeah, well, actually, I appointed myself an editor because I don't like writing into the ether. I'm far too sort of reckless in the stuff I say. I actually always needed somebody to say, "Are you sure you want to say that?"
Yeah.
And now that my wonderful husband is no longer around,
who would probably have been on Substack himself, I would imagine.
Oh, 100%. I think Harry would have had a Substack. He loved Twitter. He was always tweeting maniacally every day from the diner. And yeah, he would have been all over Substack. No, I mean, I think you take the tools of the moment and you sort of sample what you can do with them, and it's more fun.
And if we get a lot of younger listeners, Tina, as you know, a lot of aspiring journalists who write to the show who want to get into this game, what would Tina Brown's advice be to a young journalist who's listening to this, thinking about a career ahead?
Well, I think you have to be much more enterprising now about sort of making your own luck, as it were. I think that if you can't find something to work on, you've got to start your own. I mean, you can start. I mean, people have started new platforms through Substack, actually. I mean, and you can start writing or coming up with something to put on one of these platforms, and then gather around you a community of others doing it, and soon you'll have a publication essentially. So I think maybe that is the best way to go if you're starting at the beginning. I mean, I still feel to be mentored is terribly important. So that's what you lack. If you're going to write do something like Substack, you are on your own, sort of being unmentored.
But the qualities that you need are the same as it was for Harry Evans or for you.
I think that we need editors. I think that everyone needs an editor to learn from. And the reason I started the Sir Harry Evans Fellowship with Reuters was to be able to take a young, unformed talent, essentially, who was just learning, and put them in a place where they were going to have role models and mentors. And the latest Sahari Fellow actually spoke on our summit, the Truth Tellers Summit, on Wednesday. And he talked about how incredible it had been for him to be in the Australian Bureau of Reuters and being really mentored by this brilliant investigative journalist, how much he'd learned. So that's what you lack, is not having the colleagues to sort of help to mould you, essentially.
You need to be braver today. Braver than in the past.
I do. I think you do have to be. I think it's a kind of lonely time for a young talent. And the best thing you can do is to form a community with others as fast as you can. I mean, I think there's strength in numbers too. At Truth Tellers Summit, we have this thing called the Bootstrappers Lunch, where we bring in all the young, all the young journalists. I try to fill the room with very young journalists so that they have an opportunity to meet mentors there, and it's actually worked. I mean, we've put together lots of young journalists with sort of more seasoned people who don't actually get to meet these, young Turks, as it were, and they're very delighted to meet this young talent, and the young talent then finds a way to end up being like a producer on the Laura Kuenssberg show, which one of them ended up being. So it's like, that's something I can do, with my sort of Rolodex seasoned colleagues, people I know. I love putting it together with young talent, and I do a lot of helping of young talent, actually, I have to say, of trying to kind of connect them wherever I can.
Any other job that you haven't already had, Tina, that you fancy when you survey the landscape of where we are?
I mean, I love doing the convenings, I have to say. I mean, I'd like to grow Truth Tellers into being perhaps more than...
Would you do it all? Do you think if you were 21 now, do you think you'd go into journalism now?
I think I always would, because I'm just a news junkie who is just insanely curious about people, and journalism gives you a wonderful way to ask really inappropriate questions and get the answers. I love journalism. I don't think I'm a storyteller, and I can't imagine not ever having chosen that career. I mean, I was like, Harry and I together were this kind of obsessive sort of journalistic partnership. We just love telling the stories. We see stories. I see stories everywhere, and I'm always sort of texting friends and saying, "Have you seen this? Why don't you do a piece about it? Because it's such an incredible story." So I'm a ghost assigner as well of lots of people who are still in my life.
Tina Brown, been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you, Tina.
Thank you.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.